great that you're able to come and talk to us here and do this interview with us. I know you've been so busy through the conference, and I really appreciate you just taking the time to come and talk to us.
Sure, it's great to be here with you, Tom, and Nancy, you as well.
That's great. As I just mentioned, you really are incredibly busy, incredibly involved in professional activities. And I was wondering if you could tell us what you've been up to lately, maybe the highlights of the last 6 months to a year, maybe? Just give us a little update of what's going on.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the great things about being a faculty member at the University of Illinois as a librarian there, we are eligible for sabbaticals. And so I actually am just coming off of a 9-month sabbatical, which was pretty much the last academic year. So of course we're here in the beginning of November, so I've been back at work for a few months now. But that was a really wonderful time to really focus in on scholarship, do a bunch of writing, and get some research projects both wrapped up as well as some others underway. So in some ways, I think what you're seeing here at this conference and with some of my other activities is sort of the public face of 9 months of work, and really being able to engage with some of these things and share the results. And so it was a wonderful sabbatical. I highly recommend it. Highly productive, but also rejuvenating, exactly the way a sabbatical is supposed to work.
What would you say would be the highlight projects that you've been involved in?
Sure. One of the things, well, I joined the Scholarly Kitchen as a chef during that time, so it was nice to be able to have the time to write some of those essays, which has been a really enjoyable process, and including the readership there. I've also established a process of working with at least 2 iSchool students every semester on a research project that is of mutual interest to us. And so one of the sessions I had here at this conference was with 2 of my students who had done a project with me last year. So we're sharing the results from that. So really getting that established as sort of a routine way of doing things was a really great piece of that. I was also writing a book, which was the real focus of that, which is on teaching for librarians. That's not quite finished yet, but watch for that next year.
Yeah, we will.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So you are coordinator, speaking of education, for information literacy and instruction at Illinois Urbana. We've gone through many different schemes over the years to try to improve competency of students, but obviously there's a lot of work need to be done. Where do you see information literacy today and the roles that librarians are playing in that teaching learning cycle?
Yeah, so the great thing in my career, what I have seen is we've moved from sort of thinking of what we now call information literacy as sort of maybe an extra service that a library may or may not provide, and really saying, well, does the library have an educational role, to really full on being very clear that the library at every institution has an educational role with respect to students and curriculum development. And then of course at research universities with respect to faculty research. I mean, it's not that we've given up other roles, it's that we've really seen, I think, the development of this educational role in a more fulsome way, which has been great for me because this has been my area of focus in librarianship the entire time. When I was at the community college, when I was at Illinois State University, and now at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I think the reality is that the degree to which information is so much more available, you might think, oh, well, now we don't have to teach them because they can just Google it. But ironically, in some ways, it was easier to teach people how to search and find information in an environment of scarcity, because you could really lay out the pathways and what you were going for. And increasingly, I think our educational programs have really turned their attention to information management, information overload. And then, of course, as content types have just proliferated, I mean, you know, we certainly weren't teaching students about preprints and these sorts of things when I was doing this work originally. So I'm sure you've seen some of these changes as well.
Oh, yes.
So it certainly created a much more complex information environment. And we know sometimes even as librarians, it's hard for us to look at that document that we find in an institutional repository and be like, is this the preprint, the author manuscript, the postprint? Like, what version is this? And we at least know there are versions. So I think, you know, in some ways, scholarly communications and that cycle has really come into our information literacy work even more. And then, of course, I think, you know, it goes without saying these days that we're also seeing sort of a national and international conversation about the role of media and what do we trust and how is news made and what is the role of propaganda and misinformation. And that's really come home for us in ways that it hasn't in recent years. And so there's been a great growth in and librarians really working with faculty and students in that area as well.
Another area that I know you've become involved in over the last few months has been RA21, the whole research access new proposed standard from NISO. I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of background as to why this was something of interest to you to get involved in and where you see this going.
Well, I mean, I think it goes without saying that we're all very aware of the challenges that users have accessing resources on campus or off, but particularly off campus is a real challenge for our users. Lots of barriers, lots of technologies to navigate, and a lack of real standardization. So I think the real strength of RA21, the Resource Access 21, is turning some attention to that user experience. And of course, I have to give credit here to Roger Schoenfeld, my fellow scholarly kitchen chef, who really did a lot of writing on this a couple of years ago, just trying to raise the awareness in the publisher community around the challenges that users were facing. Of course, in addition to my enthusiasm for us working on these issues of user research, I have some concerns about some of the privacy implications. It's certainly the case that one can implement Shibboleth, RA21's chosen SAML technologies, in a privacy protecting way, but the technology itself is not privacy protecting. It's the policies that go around that are privacy protecting. And so I'd really like to see RA21 take a stronger stance about being RA21 compliant, meaning not just using the technologies, but using them under a particular policy regime. And I know Todd Carpenter, the executive director of NISO, has talked about the possibility of RA21 adopting the NISO privacy principles. That would certainly be a very welcome step forward from my perspective. I still also think that there is potentially a role for the proxy server. And I'm not entirely convinced that we need everyone logging in as individuals all the time. I do know that the proxy server is a known area of security weakness that publishers are concerned about. It is often the case that Sci-Hub or other illicit approaches, shall we say, to content gathering exploit weaknesses in any sort of login system. So some of the weaknesses of the proxy server are also some of its strengths, and so that's an internal tension, of course. I think we have that same issue with RA21. Some of the strengths there, which is that we'll know exactly who was logging in, exactly what they were doing, while that is a security benefit, it is a privacy risk. And so we're always balancing these issues. So I was invited and happy to participate in the privacy working group of RA21, and I do give credit to the STM and NISO for inviting me onto that, because when you invite your critic to the table, I think that says something about your desires. As I said, I'd really welcome a policy statement from them about privacy being prioritized at the policy level as well.
Very good.
Now, before you came over to chat with us, you were updating the conference on ATG trend spotting, an initiative that Charleston Conference and Against the Grain have just kind of begun. And I was wondering, for those folks, our viewers who aren't familiar with ATG trend spotting, I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about the background. What is AT trend spotting? What is it intended to do?
Yeah, it's a very exciting. I was really pleased to be invited to provide a leadership role in the ATG Trend Spotting Initiative. Our sort of public kickoff, if you will, was in July when we had our first webinar, and we invited the community at large to contribute their insights around the trends that they were seeing in the broader environment that were impacting on the information industry, scholarly communications, scholarly publishing, libraries, users, and the like. And really inviting us to think about, not just the day-to-day, but what are the forces that are shaping our day-to-day. And so we had a process where we invited participation. Maybe you too, I don't know, filled out my survey. We had a number of contributions that were very, very thoughtful. Some of them ran in the length of even a page of text, with people sort of exploring some of these ideas, which was really wonderful. We synthesized all that input from the survey into what we saw as sort of 9 primary themes or trends that people were identifying. And I won't be able to repeat all 9 of those off the top of my head, but one of them being, of course, about the rise of algorithms and AI, for example. Another one being around the issue of personalization. Just the whole world seems to be personalizing itself to us, and then what does implications for that? So we synthesized those, and then on Monday we had an invitational meeting, a kind of a think tank, if you
Yeah.
will, almost, where we discussed those 9 trends with about 35 people, I think, were in the room, and sort of really dug into, like, how fast is this trend coming at us? How transformative would it be? You know, is it going to really change everything, or is it change something in specific? And then how desirable? Right? Some trends might be super desirable, some might be undesirable, some might be a combination of both. So we've got some great feedback. I've got a whole stack of pieces of paper with people's ideas on them. And so then 3 of the participants in the Trend Lab on Monday joined me just now, as you said, for the Trend panel, where we sort of shared out. And actually most exciting to me is after we shared out some of our reflections, we had passed out the 9 trends and their descriptions to everyone in the room, and people started actually having that same conversation, which that's the real important thing for me, because our goal here isn't to sort of publish the top 6 most important trends. Our goal is a community engaged process where we collectively turn our attention to continuously examining what are these things that are influencing us. And so it's not a matter of this is the most important or that's the most important, because what's most important may depend whether you're a librarian or a publisher, a user, researcher, whoever. But for us to develop kind of almost like a habit of mind of saying, how do we focus on those kinds of trends that are happening, in part so we don't wake up one day and are like, whoa, what just happened? Because it didn't just happen. Also, the future's not inevitable. So, you know, what might
It's
seem
not
like
predetermined
it's
in
coming for
any
us,
stretch, yeah.
we might be able to influence it. So a future, I hope, is inevitable.
Right.
But any given future is not inevitable. So I think this actually creates a possibility of some agency in our community as well.
Can you talk a little bit about the event itself,
Sure.
and your role in it,
Yeah.
and who the participants were, what sectors of the industry they represented?
Yeah. So as I said, I think we had about 35 people who responded to our invitation. And of course, you know, that means coming to Charleston even a day earlier, you know, so Monday afternoon, late afternoon for 2 hours. So Katina Stouch had invited me to serve as the Trend Lab director, I guess is what we came up with the title, and to work with her and you, Tom, and Leah, and Heather Staines, and Mark Sandler, and Pat, to sort of organize this event. And I really thank all of you for your feedback, because I think it was stronger for being a community developed process. So we talked a little bit about our trends, and then we did a first round of discussion, each table having its own trend. Took a break. Breaks are important in this kind of thing, because sometimes during that break time, you end up still talking about it, but you're talking about it in a different way. Then the idea that we had planned was people were going to switch tables. But I was overruled collectively because people wanted to keep talking. They said, no, we haven't gone deep enough about this. So there were a couple tables that they decided they wanted to break up and go join other tables. So in the end, I lost complete control of this, but that is great, because my goal is a community-owned process. So it worked. So I think, you know, so then coming out of this conference, we have this idea of a set of trend texts, as we're calling them, which would be a series of essays exploring individual trends or inviting people to reflect on just the collective experience. I had a couple of people approach me and say, can we co-author? And they were particularly, and this goes to your who was there, you know, saying like, well, there's a librarian and a publisher who want to co-author around this particular trend and bring those different perspectives. So when we set our invitation list, you know, I wish we could just have all thousands of people at these events, but you can't do that. So we specifically sought to invite publishers, technology providers, librarians, authors, like the full spectrum of the diversity of our information industry community. And this year we also put some real attention to trying to engage some of our younger, I shouldn't say younger, newer to their field professionals. They may or not be young in age, but new to the field, because we wanted to make sure that we're looking at these trends not just as people really experience, not just people as new, but so bringing those cross-generational perspectives in addition to the cross-sector perspectives. So when I look at who we were able to have attend, I'm pretty pleased. I think the general, I got a lot of feedback from people saying that they'd like it if we could have even more newer people join us. They felt that that was really great. Maybe even a couple students in the future. So we'll have to figure out how to fund that, because I think especially when it comes to students, you know, they don't have an organization that's going to sponsor that. So we might need ATG to step up, but we'll figure it out. I know. So
Well, increasing the diversity, I think, is a good idea.
Absolutely, absolutely, we need that. So I'm really grateful to everyone who came, because you know, I had the privilege of sort of observing the event as it was happening, and you know, sometimes people are in a discussion and you know they're sort of half there, and I mean people were all in, you know, the body language, and in fact one of the big takeaways at the panel now is they were all like, I wish we had had 3 hours. So, you know, there's a limit, but I mean, I think people found value in the discussion itself.
Well, rather than necessarily, because you had mentioned that you're not going to be able to think of what all the trends are, but especially the difference between the meeting on Monday and the meeting you just had, was there basic agreement, or did people come up with new ideas or reactions that were kind of unexpected?
So I haven't had a chance to go through all the handwritten sheets from Monday yet, so I don't want to say this isn't there. But one thing that came out in the discussion we were just having with this sort of the next group of people that were having this discussion, 2 things I'll mention. One is another trend, and one is an idea of how to keep this conversation going. So one trend that sort of emerged as I was listening to this discussion, I said it feels like we're coalescing around the idea of consolidation and scale. And scale is like the positive version, and consolidation is kind of the negative version, right? And sort of what do we lose and what do we gain by scale and consolidation? And so that might be a trend, right? Like the trend to scale and consolidation. But then that question of, well, then what happens to the niche and the independent? And so we've already got a trend for next year on the table. The other thing was people were saying how they really loved the idea of Charleston sort of being the home and a generator of this conversation, but they felt that it would be ultimately, you know, disappointing if it was only happening at Charleston. And so they were saying it'd be great to see this conversation happen online or maybe at other conferences, which gave me the idea, I think this is where my role comes in, of like, oh, maybe another deliverable, you know, my work plan for this has a bunch of deliverables. And I was like, you know, maybe there's a deliverable that's like a trend lab toolkit. Like you're going to have the Minnesota Academic Library Association conference. That's not his name, but, you know, and you want to hold a trend discussion as part of that. Like, could I, you know, give you a little tip sheet and a little, here's how to do it. Not because that would be a set of rules you had to follow. So not in that sort of prescriptive way, but in that sort of community building, like, here's a toolkit. Change it if you want to change it, but here's some things that we could say could work for you. And I thought that was a really great idea. And it also to me, it was an indicator that people are finding value in this because they're trying to figure out how to extend it.
Yeah, extending and expanding it.
Yeah. So,
and so in terms of reporting out, there will be a report that will just be published.
Yes, and in fact, is it Don Hawkins, the conference blogger?
Yes, he's been doing the blogging.
Yeah, he actually did post, like within minutes, I feel like, a blog summary of the Trend Lab on the Charleston conference site. And then, of course, we have this event right now, but we will have, you know, a report, and hopefully, as I said, these trend texts, these essays where people reflect on. And I think we're still trying to figure out the right way to do this. I have a couple of people who have said to me, oh, maybe it should be a special issue, maybe it should be a column. So we got to see here, because I keep saying, I'm also hearing a lot of we, and I always have to like make sure I understand that there's a real we-ness here.
Right, it's not, it's just you.
Yeah, no, I don't think it is. I think there's I know, really, honestly, I'm feeling a lot of people wanting to. In fact, I can say that on the sheets I collected on Monday, 10 of the people who turned in sheets said they were interested in the possibility of writing a trend text. I actually got 3 more business cards, just even at this one, of somebody who was just at this panel saying, well, I might be interested. So hopefully we're creating that process where people feel they can participate.
Well, and it would allow for regionalisms, you know, by having all of those voices
Yeah.
given a chance
As
to.
I said, I mean, I think when you read a lot of trend reports that come out of other associations, and I think these have value, so I'm not in any way critiquing the approach, where they do say, like, these are our top trends for this year, right?
Right.
That's one approach, and I think the value with the approach we're taking here is that it's a complement to that approach.
Right.
It's not trying to define them in some sort of like list way. It's trying to create an approach that moves the community in this trend thinking direction.
Yes. Yeah.
That's about you looking at trends. I mean, maybe my trends for my job are even different than the trends for the librarians sitting in the office right next to me.
Sure.
But then there's trends for my library, there's trends for my institution, there's trends for all academic libraries. Like, I don't, so I think, as I said, to me, the value here is going to be more in the process and in the engagement, as opposed to sort of trying to come up with the Charleston top 10 or something.
Right.
I mean, I'm sure there would be value in that too, but that's not the passion I bring to this, I guess.
Well, what you're doing is you're creating, talk about information literacy, sort of an assessment literacy or an assessment platform, so that people have a chance to look at that and think about it for themselves, as well as for their communities, and so on. That's
it's kind
very
of like
helpful.
encouraging people to develop some foresight literacy or forecasting literacies. As librarians and publishers, we're not surprised to hear there are journals of future studies, right? There's an association of futures professionals. I don't think we're going to turn us all into expert forecasters. I think we're going to develop the ability to sort of have, foresight or forecasting literacy, that basic skill that then we can draw on the more, those big reports that do get published, and we can make better sense of those reports.
But once you have that literacy, you can apply that to yourself, you can apply it to other things. So this really is a very important, even if it weren't trend spotting. It's an important literacy that I don't think, publishers are having problems with their own being able to forecast and figure out the importance of things, and technology industries and so on. So this really is a very important first step in that direction.
So futures literacy, I don't know, trend literacy, who knows, we'll invent another literacy
You'll come up with
tomorrow.
a name.
Well, when you see the future of ATG trend spotting, how do you see it evolving, and how would you like it to evolve?
Well, as I said, we had this plan, which is to have the texts come out over the next few months, and then, as designed, the goal is to kick off again next spring with another webinar that then has a survey and invites people to, in some ways, identify the trends they'd like to have discussed at the Trend Lab, right? And I guess there's this year we didn't have that out till July. We were starting a little bit later. So I think our goal, if I recall, our timeline is a little bit more of the like April, May time, get this discussion happening, in particular so that we can invite people a little earlier so they can make their plans for Charleston. You know how this all has to, timelines, right? But in many ways, I loved all the enthusiasm today. So if people want to take this and like even take the handouts that I had and make their own toolkit if I can't get it done fast enough, I think in some ways what I want to have happen is for the community to make it what it needs it to be. So I'm happy to run a process here at Charleston, and that would be plenty successful, but a real success would be for the community to take it and say, here's how we're going to use it at Minnesota. Here's how I'm going to take it to my library. Here's how I'm taking it to this publishing company.
To use it as a model. To
the
do their own.
platform almost.
Their own
So
trend
I
spotting.
think we can continue to do something, at the Charleston conference and with ATG, but hopefully that's a platform or a centering activity, but not the only activity.
Right.
So I guess we'll see though, right?
And ATG trend spotting was not your only activity here at the
It was
conference
not.
either. You were doing a bunch of other stuff, and I'd love you to talk about that.
Yeah.
I'm particularly interested in the program that you do with your two students.
Sure. I'm happy to talk about that. Paige Dine and Jenny Brooksford, two School of Information Sciences students, they're graduating in May, worked with me on a project. I've long been interested in, from an information literacy perspective, obviously the librarian comes into the class. We influence, hopefully, how the students see the library. But as a student myself, I know that textbooks talk about libraries, or don't, when they talk about the research process. So I've long been interested in thinking about how are students' perceptions of the library and the role of the library influenced by other things, right? We know they're influenced by their faculty members because we know from every survey, right? Like, why did you come into the library today? A faculty member gave me an assignment, right? Like, there's a real direct influence. But I'm also interested in these more sort of environmental influences, I guess.
Right.
And the textbooks seem to be one of these key pieces in this. And so I tucked away this, I've got a whole file folder of research ideas. I tucked this idea away back in about 1999, 2000, you know, and I just, every time somebody comes to me wanting to do an independent study project as an high school student, we talk and we're, what are you interested in? And I pulled this one out, and Paige and Jenny were interested in this. So we looked at the way that libraries, librarians, information literacy, and the research process, scholarly communications, were represented in entry-level college science textbooks. So we looked at entry-level college textbooks in physics, chemistry, and biology. And there's a whole protocol for how we found the textbooks, and it's in the paper. Long story short, identified 75 textbooks. We're able to get our hands on 74 of them. This is a real experience of trying to get your hands on textbooks. And we had a protocol for interrogating those textbooks and looking at where they talked about research and the like. So unfortunately, libraries and librarians, not so mentioned. And when they are mentioned, not always in the way that certainly librarians and libraries would like to be mentioned. The biggest concept that was sort of talked about in a fair bit was peer review, actually, and the notion of primary and secondary literature. So, it's not that it was never discussed in any textbooks, but collectively. Now, we did identify, I guess what we call as a handful of sort of like textbooks that we think do this well, that we could sort of look at and say, here's how they've integrated some of these things. I keep saying we, but I really want to be clear. I'm their advisor here. I'm very involved with the project, but you know from doing research that a lot of this is just a lot of hours of work, and this is really the two of them and their insights here. So it's such a pleasure to work with them. So out of that, we actually had a checklist or a set of advice for librarians and publishers about how to try and influence what textbook is chosen. If you can't do that, here's a way to create some supplemental materials. And then we actually had a call to the publishers to say, hey, maybe you could nudge your authors and editors in the direction of doing some of these things. And I won't say who, because I think it'd be a little bit too revealing at this point, but we did have one publisher come up to us afterwards and say, you just made me think about this. Would you be willing to run a pilot if we did, something?
Very good.
So, I think that
you-
kind of research immediate impact is pretty pleasing.
You're already
but-
seeing some fruit. from
So we were really pleased with the questions that we got. And as I'm just going to always give a big shout out. We have such an amazing School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois at Urbana. Really talented students, really engaged in building the future of the profession and their work. So, I've kind of got 2 a semester these days, sort
That's
of
great.
working on my projects and
Well, that's
doing
got to
things
be
that are
encouraging to
interesting.
meet all these young, bright
Oh, yeah,
students
yeah.
and realizing that the profession is in good hands.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, a couple years ago, I had another student with me here at Charleston, and she had done really interesting. She was a historian by training, and we went back and she analyzed the way that library automation was talked about, like when we were putting in the OPAC for the first time, and the way it was talked about, and what that was going to do to libraries. And then we juxtaposed that with, at that point, what's the rhetoric around the discovery layer, and looked at these 2 sort of moments and the way that information access was being talked about. So, they bring such interesting backgrounds to this work. And then my privilege is, of course, just being able to say, oh, like I can see in the field, they don't know yet what the field needs, but I can see that, and they have their talents, and it's just it's wonderful.
Must be great to be able
Yeah.
to bring it all together.
It is.
Yeah.
It's. I mean, you can tell because I could just keep talking an hour about it, so I'll slow down. But
So where would that have been published? And where are you one of the authors so we could find it through
right,
you?
so it hasn't been published yet.
Oh, okay.
So we're working on that actual scholarly paper. So we have some ideas of where we'll be submitting it, but it'd probably be unfair for us to
Let's say now.
Yeah, and then we will. I think you can expect to see a scholarly kitchen blog post with some of the
Very
more
good.
pragmatic things as well. So yeah, but I will be one of the authors. So
Okay,
yeah.
good. So we can find it
Yeah,
through that.
absolutely.
Well, now you've brought up the scholarly kitchen, and you've recently become one of the cooks in the kitchen.
I have.
And in addition to everything else you're doing, that's kind of adds to your workload. But at the
Mm-hmm.
same time, I'd be interested in finding out why you decided to take that on, but also the perspective that you're going to be able to give to that of the other cooks in the kitchen.
Yeah. So yes, it's certainly something else to take on, and so I joined just this year. I had done a guest post before that, but so I guess I had shown that I could cook something up. It's really been a great pleasure to engage in that venue because, I mean, first of all, it's very interesting, I think, to have a publication venue that particularly seeks to serve a given audience, but from a lot of different perspectives. So I think it's fair to say, I mean, obviously, if you read The Scholarly Kitchen, that the chefs themselves do not agree with each other. Not only do we bring different perspectives, we often just come to different conclusions about certain things. And I think one of the things that's actually a benefit there is that we are able to model, if you will, a kind of engaged dialogue across difference. Even if we don't change our minds, hopefully we're able to sort of say, like, here's one way of seeing this, here's another way, here's where we agree, disagree. But I mean, the impact of The Scholarly Kitchen is undeniable. The readership is very, very high. The commenting is certainly very engaged. And I think we've really worked hard to move that comment section to a more sort of process of engagement and discussion. So I think we're continuing to move in that direction. From my perspective, why do I put my efforts here? To me, it was a great opportunity to bring a perspective that I think I can bring. I'm not the only one who could bring this perspective, but I am uniquely, I think, bringing this perspective right now as, a librarian who is user-centered in her work. So Rick Anderson, also a librarian, fantastic work. He's a collections-focused person. I'm the other librarian, and my work is focused on the user and educating them, their user experiences. And it's not that Rick and I don't have areas of overlap, but we do bring different perspectives. And I think that's one thing I've had a lot of feedback from people is that they are appreciating my bringing sort of by proxy, if you will, the users into this conversation in a certain way, and advocating for that. We have to focus on the user as our sort of our common raison d'etre across publishing and librarianship. So I've really valued that opportunity to bring that forward. It is a certain kind of writing that's very different. I mean, I won't go so far as to say it's, I'm not a public intellectual in that sort of, way that we sometimes think, but it is a kind of public intellectual kind of venue because you are saying, this is how I see the world, and here's how I think you should see the world. And that's a very different kind of writing than academic scholarship, which I also do. I mean, I write that article that's got the methods, the findings, and it's been a kind of a fun professional development growth opportunity for me as a thinker to put my ideas out in a different way, and to engage there. So
We all are writing think pieces for the rest of us to think about.
yeah, I guess so. yeah. So
Pretty much.
yeah, I mean, and I have also appreciated the opportunity. This is a little hidden, which is fine. One of the posts that I wrote was actually called Be Our Guest, which was about being a guest author. Because I felt that while the Scholarly Kitchen was very open to having guests, it hadn't sort of made public the process. So there's kind of a continuous issuing of an invitation, but not a laying out of what that like quite literally looks like. And so I think particularly since I was new to the kitchen, I was able to say like, well, here's my understanding. And then David and Angela as the editors were, but as a result, I've actually ended up our metaphor, so it's a mixed metaphor because it's not a kitchen one, but shepherding a number of guest posts that have come to fruition that have also had really nice readership. And so I've got a couple that are, I'm working with right now, people writing their posts. And this is often a good way for people who do have something that's really of interest to the Scholarly Kitchen readership, but maybe are not interested in being a continuing member of the kitchen, or, it's a one-time thing for them. And so that's something I've really enjoyed, is helping other people learn to write for this place as well, because some of those first drafts can come in, if you haven't written for this kind of venue, it's very different, but it's good.
Well, I think it makes the Scholarly Kitchen even more valuable for the rest of us to have more perspectives being expressed.
Well, and especially from the collections is an important area. But the other part is definitely important as well. So at least it's a more balanced perspective now that you're on board.
Yeah, I'm very pleased to hear that there's a public services perspective, which is basically what you're talking about.
Yeah. And another thing that you're really involved with, and you've been touching on it, is your work with the information school there. Could you talk about what, as a practicing librarian, looking at maybe back when you were in school, but seeing where things are and where you see it going for the future? What are sort of the main kind of trends or changes?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's always dangerous to, generalize from one iSchool to all iSchools. So, I think it goes without saying that we're seeing the continuous sort of integration of technologies and emphasis on data into the schools of information science. There was controversy last year when or a couple of years ago, I guess now, we changed from being the Graduate School of Library and Information Science to the School of Information Sciences. And, as a librarian, that L word, right? And that, but I think, within that recasting, it really strengthened the school's position on campus, because as much as we might like it to be all about the ideas and all about education, it's also all about politics and money, and the ability for the school to grow really makes its presence on campus stronger, and actually ultimately ensures that we will have the library school, and we will have that library education because it gets hosted, if you will, in a school that's growing and stronger and better positioned on campus. So I think there's some real opportunities, especially as the school develops its master's in information management, starting an undergraduate degree in a data area, to see some real integrations too between library science and some of these other areas. The School of Information Science has a really strong youth services program, children's literature, storytelling. I'm primarily, of course, my attention is to those classes that are connected more with academic librarianship, because that's my personal passion. And I really see that the value there, we have such a strong partnership between the iSchool and the university library, and the assistantships and the independent studies and the practicums, that I think that is, from my perspective, maybe I would say this, but I think that's a real hallmark of the students who come out of the University of Illinois iSchool with a goal on academic librarianship, that they've in some ways been in practice in our library, and with some, not saying just myself. I mean, I have amazing colleagues in almost every area. It's a rare week when somebody at my institution isn't receiving best paper for something, or a lifetime achievement award, which is wonderful. I mean, when I say that, I don't want to sound jaded at all. It's just, I'm always happy to be writing off that congratulations, but it just really realized what a rich environment it is for a new librarian to sort of learn their trade.
Well, and to be in an environment where you're seeing the research and you're actually helping make that happen, but you're not just doing the day-to-day.
Right.
You actually have that energy that comes from the new discoveries.
Oh yeah, I mean, one of the things I often say to people is one of the great challenges and great opportunities is because we have these people who are coming into our library intending a career in librarianship. I have to explain my work every year or every other year to a new grad student who's my information literacy grad assistant. And so, as you explain to somebody why you're doing something or how you're doing it, you hear yourself saying things that you're like, like, so it's that process of having to externalize that in some ways lets you set it out there so you can even see it anew.
Sure.
But often they ask really insightful questions too. And, sometimes the answer is, you are correct, that is not the best way to do this, but we are doing it this way for this reason and it's not changeable. Other times they've asked a question and you're like, oh, actually that's changed. We don't have to do that anymore. So I find that, that process of re-explaining and re-justifying in some cases is very generative for
Well, it's sort of
innovation.
you're actually reimagining it for yourself in a sense and,
Exactly.
and watching the reimagination of an institution,
Yeah.
and I think libraries as institutions have undergone an awfully lot more rapid change than a lot of other fields have, with the dramatic changes in access and resources and so on.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah,
technology is such a big part of what we do nowadays that's
Yeah.
just the way it happens. Yeah.
So, I mean, for me, it's a real delight to get to work with the students in the School of Information Sciences, and especially working with them when they have these independent research projects, being able to bring them to their to their first conference and introduce them, mentor them in that environment as well is a really great honor.
That's great.
We have an occasional column on the ATG website called Charleston Voices. And a few months ago, we had two librarians discussing the pros and cons of the MLS. And as a library educator, I'd really like to know what you think of the MLS. Is the degree keeping up to the needs of the profession? And if so, tell us how. And if not, why not and how it could?
Yeah, I mean, that's always, I feel like that's the question that every good degree program is always asking itself, and especially a professional degree, which is different than sort of what we sometimes say the academic degree and the professional degree, although I feel this professional degree is pretty academic too. So, but particularly when it's driving into a professional field, I think that's one of the questions you have to always be asking yourself. And I think you also have to be saying, so what function is the degree supposed to be serving within the field? So is it to lay down a foundation of principles and basics upon which you expect will be built? Or is it to provide a day one work ready person? Right? Because those may not be the same thing. And so I feel like a lot of debate or discussion around this is actually a disconnect around whether you're providing a work-ready day one employee or if you're educating somebody with the foundations of a profession. So I fall into more of you are educating somebody to have the foundations of a profession. And I think I am not trying to provide a day one, how to do all the procedures, work ready person. Not to say that people don't need to have some skills and abilities, but libraries are not uniform. And so the training people need to actually operate on the job cannot be uniform. So, I mean, I think that's part of the tension. I think the other tension with the degree is the extent to which the degree functions as a gatekeeping role to the profession, which is actually a slightly different question than whether the degree is keeping up. So I also, will expose my own belief here, which is that I believe that the MLS is a pathway into the profession. It can be a valuable pathway without being the only pathway. And I think sometimes in order to sort of argue for the value of the MLS, people end up arguing for the MLS as an exclusive pathway. And I have some concerns about the MLS as an exclusive pathway, not the least of which has to do with the financials of getting that degree, the availability of that degree, but also what it means to sort of like have a degree that functions that way but isn't regulated in that way. So I personally, as I said, I'm a believer in multiple pathways to the profession, the MLS being one pathway. Having said that, I think when libraries then hire people without an MLS, then you have some additional obligations to those employees as well as to the profession. So one of the things I see happening then is your onboarding, to use the technical term, has to encompass certain things that historically it did not. So if you're hiring everyone who has an MLS, then you sort of assume some introduction to the values of the profession, privacy, intellectual freedom, those sorts of things. If you hire people into this from other pathways, then you have to ask yourself, have they been introduced to these concepts? And if not, then you have an obligation to provide that. Just like you would have the obligation to provide someone on the particular processes that you use for cataloging and acquisitions.
Sure.
So that's, I think, the sort of, there's a weird thing going on of like both the field, the profession, the library is sometimes critiquing the degree for not providing day one ready workers at the same time as hiring people who may be day one ready, but then don't have the foundation. And so I think every institution has to negotiate that for themselves. But as I said, I believe in the MLS. I believe the MLS can be a very quality experience and good pathway to the profession. I don't think for that to be true that it has to be the only pathway to the profession.
I think that's especially true today, given the skills that are needed in libraries. But I also agree with you that those foundational concepts need people who work in libraries need to be aware of those concepts.
And I mean, the other thing I want to be really clear when I say this, I mean, I believe that those values are actually one way for us to recruit people with some of the skills we need who honestly can command a higher salary on the marketplace than libraries typically can provide them, but we can provide something that other settings cannot, which is an opportunity to use those technical skills in the service of particular goals and in the context of particular values. And so, not to say that, I mean, I am always for raising everyone's wages who is a worker. Having said that, if you can't compete in the marketplace, but you're still paying a decent wage, pointing out the benefits of putting your skills to use in this environment can be very attractive for people. And so many people across the world choose to use their skills in a setting that matches their values, even if they could command more money in a different setting. Somebody here suggested to me that if I would like to go work for any number of other places, that there would be places that would be happy to have my skills. And I was like, I think that is both true, and it is not the environment in which I want to be using those skills. So I think we have some unique recruiting opportunities there. But then when we bring people in from those other fields, we owe them sort of the foundations.
Well, there's something to be said about personal fulfillment
Exactly.
and serving other people. A lot of people are into that. I mean, most people who work in libraries aren't in it for the money. At least nobody I know is. So I think you're on target.
Yeah. So I mean, I think, at the same time, I never want that to be used as a way to dismiss the needs, to be very attentive to the fact that many people in libraries are highly underpaid, especially when you look at the staff levels of our libraries. It's a great area of concern for me. So I always have to add that, because I never want it to be said that, oh, well, we don't need to worry about what we pay people because they're being personally fulfilled, because ultimately they have immense student loans beyond what any of us in this room ever had. Which has implications for being able to buy a house, being able to have children. And, you're increasingly hearing people, I know my colleagues, who themselves are paying off their student loan debt at the same time that their children are now taking loans for college, and you just see So we really do still have to address
Oh,
the
yeah,
issues of
yeah.
wages. So.
Well, personal fulfillment isn't paying the bills
No,
necessarily.
yeah. As
so,
I sometimes
yeah.
like to say, libraries cannot live on love alone, and neither can librarians. So.
But
Well
part
put.
of that, though, to
Well put.
extend it, the process of how to provide that additional training, I think, is significant. Because if you're taking people who don't understand privacy issues and they're working in a technical area, if they're not really thinking of that in their job, so is it if it's the responsibility of individual libraries, it becomes difficult because individual libraries can't. But that's an area in which I don't know that we as a profession have really addressed it at a higher level, to say, okay, what are those 3 or 5 or whatever overarching principles that we need to make sure that people really understand, privacy, intellectual freedom, and so
Right.
on.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a real opportunity there, obviously, for our professional associations to sort of become more inclusive in their conceptions of who they're serving, and making sure that those spaces are about people who work in libraries, not people who have the MLS.
Right.
Right?
Right,
And
that
so
it's-
how do we make that a much more inclusive thing? Because I think one thing I would say is, most people have some conception of privacy, but they may not all have the same conception of privacy. And so, ways that we operationalize that is the real question. And, it'd be much better to be on the same page as you're building tools than getting to the end and sort of being like, kind of in a conflict situation
Yes.
rather than a collaborative situation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's an issue. Well, you've covered so much. You do so much. You've really
Yeah,
covered a lot.
it's
Are there things that you would want to talk about, or that we've somehow missed in terms of talking with you?
Well, I mean, I think I probably alluded to this a number of different times, but I mean, I guess one of the things I just think increasingly we also just really need to think about in our profession, and whether you're recruiting for who writes in the ATG or who's presenting at Charleston, I just feel really passionate that we need to have people who are working front lines and newer career to be part of these conversations, and to be equal parts of this conversation, to make sure that, I mean, obviously I have the working with the iSchool students as a mechanism for that, but not everyone has that mechanism. And I just think it's something we have to stay very attentive to. And I'm going to also say I think we have to just be continuously attentive to questions of things like, the representation of people of color within our field, and are they being brought to the table and invited to the table and welcomed at the table for the perspectives that they can bring to these conversations. Same questions with women. So, I think collectively as our field, we still have a fair bit of work to do here. And that's really going to be something that's on those of us who are in these positions of privilege, sitting in these chairs, that we have to make that effort to create that space and to create that environment that says we're going to privilege these other voices as well. Because asking people who are being excluded to sort of fight the fight to get included is really not fair. So that's maybe that's I hope that's not too much of a downer, but to me, that's the hope for the future, actually, is that there's a huge opportunity here for libraries and publishing to sort of realize the vision they have of sort of this inclusive conversation. But we're going to have to stay focused on what it takes to realize that vision for us to do that. So, I think good work is happening, and we'll keep at it.
Lisa, thank you so much for coming in and chatting with us. And as Nancy said, you're doing so much. It's both inspiration and it's just enlightening to see what you're doing and to learn about what's going on. So we really appreciate it.
Great.
Again,
Well, it's a
thank you
real
so
privilege.
much.
Thank you.